Have you ever noticed that no matter how much you try to change, life somehow brings you back to the same place? You think differently, promise yourself this time will be different, take new actions, and yet, days or years later, the same emotions return, the same frustrations, the same invisible wall. It's not always dramatic. Sometimes it's subtle, a familiar feeling when you wake up, a quiet sense that you're moving, but not really going anywhere. As if life is pressing replay while you're fully awake. This isn't because you're failing, and it's not because you're not trying hard enough. Something deeper is at work, something that doesn't respond to effort or intention the way you expect. What if the problem isn't that your life refuses to change, but that the one who is looking at life keeps seeing it from the same place? There is a part of you that is still living in the past, and the most unsettling thing about it is that you rarely notice it. You may believe your life is guided by conscious choices, by intentions you set each morning, by the thoughts you decide to think. But most of what shapes your day does not come from the surface of awareness. It comes from a quieter layer, one that learned how to survive long ago and never updated its instructions. This part of you formed during moments when you had little control, times when disappointment repeated itself, times when love was inconsistent, when effort didn't lead to safety, when expressing yourself came at a cost. Back then, your system did something intelligent. It adapted. It created shortcuts. It learned what to expect, so it wouldn't be surprised again. That adaptation never announced itself. It didn't say, "I am now shaping your future." It simply became normal. It became your emotional reflex, your default interpretation, the way your body tightens before your mind even understands why. Years later, you may be living a completely different life on the surface. Different job, different people, different city, yet that old internal observer is still watching everything through the same lens. It scans the present for familiar threats, familiar disappointments, familiar confirmations of what it already believes. And because it is fast, automatic, and emotional, it usually speaks before your conscious mind has time to intervene. This is why change feels so frustrating. You think you are responding to what is happening now, but much of the time you are reacting to something that already happened, not once but repeatedly, until it became an identity. The past isn't remembered as a story. It's remembered as a posture, a tone, a readiness for impact. What makes this especially difficult to see is that this part of you doesn't feel foreign. It feels like me. Its thoughts sound like your thoughts. Its reactions feel justified. When it pulls you toward familiar emotional ground, it doesn't announce itself as fear or conditioning. It presents itself as realism, as wisdom, as experience talking. So when an opportunity appears, it quietly reminds you of the last time it didn't work. When someone gets close, it subtly prepares you for distance. When things start to go well, it asks how long that will last. Not in dramatic ways, in small, reasonable questions that seem responsible and mature. And because this observer has been with you for so long, you trust it. You don't question its authority. You assume it knows something you don't. After all, it kept you functioning. It helped you endure. It helped you make sense of chaos when you were younger. But survival logic is not the same as creative logic. What once protected you can later limit you. The observer that learned to brace for impact doesn't know how to relax into possibility. It doesn't understand expansion. It only understands repetition. This is why you can genuinely want a different life and still recreate the same emotional patterns. The desire for change often comes from the surface, while the steering wheel is still being held by something deeper. You may think you are choosing differently, but the chooser itself hasn't changed. The past version of you is not sitting somewhere in memory. It is active. It's alive in how you interpret tone, how quickly you assume meaning, how your body reacts before your thoughts catch up. It's in the way you finish other people's sentences internally, in the conclusions you jump to without realizing you jumped at all. And because this observer operates beneath awareness, you don't argue with it, you don't negotiate, you simply follow its lead and later call the result reality. This is not a flaw, it's a design. The nervous system prefers familiarity over happiness, predictability over freedom. It would rather replay a known discomfort than step into an unknown outcome. The known feels controllable, even when it hurts. So the loop continues, not because you lack effort or insight, but because the same internal witness keeps interpreting the world in the same way. The same meanings get assigned, the same emotional responses get activated, the same identity gets reinforced. And here's the subtle transition that most people miss. As long as this observer remains invisible to you, it will feel like life is doing this to you. Circumstances will appear to be the problem. Other people will seem like the cause. Timing will look like the enemy. But the moment you begin to sense that there is something inside you watching, interpreting, reacting, something that is not quite the same as awareness itself, a quiet tension begins to form. Not a resolution yet, just a crack, a slight distance between what happens and how it is perceived. That distance is uncomfortable at first. It challenges the idea that your reactions are automatic truths. It hints that the loop may not be happening where you thought it was happening. And without realizing it, you start standing at the edge of the next realization. That what keeps repeating may not be outside your control at all, but anchored in the way your inner observer keeps tuning reality to an old frequency. At some point, a quiet suspicion starts to appear. You look around and notice that the scenery changes, but the feeling doesn't. New places, new faces, new chances, yet the emotional outcome is strangely familiar. That's when it becomes clear that the loop is not being generated by the outside world. It's being maintained from within. Life is constantly moving. Circumstances shift, people evolve, situations dissolve and reassemble. But your internal state is not obligated to move at the same pace. The inner observer you carry acts like a filter, translating raw events into meaning. Two people can live the same situation and experience completely different realities. Not because the event is different, but because the internal lens is. What you call reality is not the world itself. It is the version of the world your nervous system allows you to perceive. And if that system is tuned to an old identity, it will keep selecting the same emotional notes, no matter how different the external conditions appear. This is why changing environments often fails. You can leave a relationship, a job, even a country, believing you've escaped the pattern. For a while, the novelty creates relief, but slowly, the same tensions return. Not because the new place is the same as the old one, but because the observer interpreting it is unchanged. The loop survives through familiarity. Your internal field, emotional, mental, physiological, emits signals constantly. Expectations, assumptions, unspoken conclusions. You are not just responding to life. You are broadcasting a version of yourself into it. And life, being relational, responds back in kind. This isn't mystical, it's practical. When your system expects struggle, it notices struggle faster. When it anticipates rejection, it becomes hyper-aware of distance and blind to warmth. Attention is selective, and selection creates experience. What you focus on grows louder. What doesn't match your internal story fades into the background. So the loop doesn't require the same events to repeat. It only needs the same emotional interpretation. Different faces can trigger the same feeling. Different challenges can awaken the same fear. The story changes its characters, but the script remains intact. Most people try to solve this by rearranging the external story. They change habits, routines, social circles, goals. These shifts can help, but only temporarily. Without touching the internal broadcaster, the signal remains the same. And eventually, reality tunes itself back to that frequency. This is where frustration deepens. You start wondering why effort doesn't seem to stick, why insight doesn't translate into lasting change, why every breakthrough feels followed by a return to the familiar. It can feel like sabotage, as if something unseen is pulling you backward. And something is, not an external force, but an internal equilibrium. The system is designed to preserve identity. Even an uncomfortable identity feels safer than an unknown one. So when your inner state begins to shift, the old observer reacts. It subtly reasserts itself, restoring emotional balance to what it recognizes as normal. This is why willpower alone doesn't work. Willpower lives at the surface. The loop lives deeper, in the automatic responses of the body, in emotional memory, in expectations you didn't consciously choose. Trying to overpower that with positive thinking is like trying to redirect a river by pushing the water with your hands. The loop persists because it is not being challenged where it operates. It isn't challenged by changing outcomes. It isn't challenged by new affirmations layered on top of old reactions. It continues because the observer keeps reading the present through the past, and as long as that happens, the outside world becomes a mirror that appears cruel or repetitive. Not because it is fixed, but because the reflection is consistent. The same inner posture meets life again and again, and life answers accordingly. There's a subtle moment when this realization lands not as blame, but as possibility. If the loop were truly outside, you would be powerless. But if it is maintained inside, then it is at least observable. And anything that can be observed is no longer absolute. This doesn't mean you immediately know how to change it. It only means the location of the problem shifts. The struggle is no longer against circumstances, but against unconscious identification, against the habit of being the same inner witness to every situation. As this understanding deepens, another uncomfortable question begins to surface. If the loop is internal, what exactly is being repeated? What part of you insists on staying the same, even when the world offers something different? And beneath that question waits an even quieter truth, that the observer itself may be emotionally invested in staying who it has always been, not out of malice but out of attachment. When you start looking closely at this inner observer, something unexpected reveals itself. It isn't just a habit. It isn't only a pattern of thought. There is an emotional grip to it, a quiet pull that feels familiar, almost comforting even when it hurts. This is where the loop gains its strength. The observer is not neutral. It is subtly addicted to the identity it has been maintaining. Identity feels solid, but it's mostly repetition. Repeated thoughts, repeated emotions, repeated reactions. Over time, these repetitions create a sense of, "This is who I am." And the mind grows attached to that sense, not because it is joyful, but because it is known. The observer keeps returning to the same inner position because that position feels like home. Even pain can become familiar enough to be preferred over uncertainty. A person who has lived with struggle for years may feel disoriented when things become calm. A person who has identified with being overlooked may feel uneasy when attention arrives. It's not that they want suffering. It's that their identity doesn't know how to exist without it. The observer reinforces this identity by narrating your experience in a consistent way. When something happens, it immediately asks, "What does this say about me?" And the answer almost always matches the old story, the story of being behind, of needing to try harder, of being the one who carries more weight than others. These narratives feel personal, but they are automatic. This is how addiction forms. Not through chemicals, but through emotional certainty. The observer craves the familiar self because it provides orientation. It knows how to navigate the world from that position. Letting go of it would mean stepping into a space without a clear script, without a predictable role. So the observer protects the identity, even when the identity is limiting. It resists change by reframing it as dangerous, unrealistic, or irresponsible. It reminds you of past failures, not to punish you, but to keep you anchored to what it knows how to manage. This is why attempts to become a new person often feel forced. On the surface, you may adopt new behaviors or language, but underneath, the observer is still loyal to the old self. It watches the change with suspicion. It waits for proof that the experiment will fail so it can return to what feels true. And when it does return, there's a strange relief. A sense of "this makes sense again." Even disappointment can feel stabilizing when it aligns with identity. The loop tightens not through despair, but through recognition. What makes this so difficult to break is that the observer confuses identity with safety. It believes that if it loosens its grip, you might lose coherence, that you might fall apart. So it keeps replaying the same internal posture, the same emotional baseline, the same interpretation of events. You might notice this in moments when life offers something different, and your first reaction isn't excitement, but doubt, or guilt, or the feeling that you don't fully belong there. These reactions are not evidence that the opportunity is wrong. They are signals that your identity is being challenged. The observer doesn't want expansion, it wants continuity. It wants to remain recognizable to itself, so it pulls you back toward familiar roles, familiar struggles, familiar emotional weights, not loudly, quietly, through thoughts that sound reasonable and protective. This is where many people misinterpret their inner resistance as intuition. They trust the voice because it feels old and authoritative. But age does not equal truth. Familiarity does not equal wisdom. Sometimes it simply means repetition. As you begin to see this, a subtle tension arises. You can feel the pull of the old identity, and at the same time, a curiosity about what exists beyond it. This curiosity doesn't feel dramatic. It feels fragile, almost shy, and the observer notices it immediately. That's when it strengthens its grip. It may encourage you to try harder externally, to fix more things, to improve the same self rather than question it. It keeps you busy refining the identity instead of loosening it. Because letting go of identity feels like loss. Not the loss of failure or pain, but the loss of a reference point. The loss of me as I know myself. And the observer is deeply invested in preserving that reference, even if it means repeating the same life over and over. This realization doesn't free you instantly. It simply shifts the struggle. The question is no longer why life won't change, but why the observer insists on staying loyal to a version of you that no longer fits. And as that question lingers, another one begins to form beneath it. What happens if change is not about becoming better, but about loosening the grip on who you believe you must remain? At some point, effort itself starts to feel heavy. You try harder, adjust more, think more carefully about what you should do differently. You change routines, set new goals, make promises to yourself. On the surface, it looks like progress. Inside, something tightens, and without realizing it, the loop grows stronger. This is one of the most confusing experiences people have with change. The more seriously they try to fix their life from the outside, the more rigid and repetitive it becomes. Not because effort is wrong, but because the direction of change is inverted. The movement is happening at the edges, while the center stays the same. When you try to change from the outside in, the same observer remains in charge. The identity we've been talking about simply finds new strategies. It learns new language, it adopts new behaviors, but it does all of this without questioning itself. The one who is trying to escape the loop is the same one maintaining it. Every external adjustment becomes a silent confirmation. I am still the person who needs to fix something. The observer stays active, alert, tense. It keeps monitoring results, measuring success, comparing expectations to outcomes. And that constant monitoring reinforces the very identity that feels trapped. This is why change driven by force often creates pressure rather than freedom. You may succeed for a while, but the effort feels strained. You're holding yourself together instead of allowing something new to organize naturally. The body senses this strain. It knows when movement is aligned and when it is compensating. Over time, this creates exhaustion. Not the exhaustion of doing too much, but the exhaustion of trying to be someone else while still standing in the same inner position. You're acting differently, but you're still watching yourself act from the same old place. The observer interprets every setback as proof that more control is needed, so it tightens further. It plans more. It analyzes more. It rehearses more. The inner dialogue becomes louder. The future becomes a project instead of a field of possibility. And here's the paradox. The harder you push, the more the system resists. Because deep change doesn't happen through pressure. Pressure belongs to survival. It activates the very mechanisms that preserve identity. The loop feeds on urgency and self-correction. This is why so many people feel like they're running in place. They're moving constantly, but not arriving anywhere new. The energy is real. The intention is real. But the direction keeps circling back to the same emotional ground. Even self-improvement can become part of the loop. The observer uses growth as another way to reinforce itself. I'm the one who's always working on myself. I'm the one who hasn't arrived yet. These identities feel productive, but they still revolve around deficiency. Trying to outgrow yourself while still believing you are incomplete creates an endless chase. Each improvement highlights another flaw. Each success sets a new bar. The observer never rests because its role is to manage, fix, and optimize. And because the observer is busy, it never stops long enough to be seen. Action becomes a distraction from awareness. Movement replaces observation. The loop stays hidden behind progress. This is why slowing down can feel threatening. If you stop trying to change, you might have to face the one who has been trying all along. You might have to notice the tension, the fear, the attachment to becoming someone else. The observer avoids this by keeping you in motion. There's also a subtle emotional payoff in trying hard. Effort creates a sense of control. It makes you feel responsible, engaged, purposeful. Letting go of that effort can feel like giving up, even when it's not. So the observer clings to effort as proof of worth. But effort without awareness is still driven by the past. It is the old identity trying to redesign the future in its own image. It doesn't know how to create something it has never been. As this becomes clearer, the struggle shifts again. The problem no longer feels like a lack of discipline or strategy. It starts to feel like a deeper misunderstanding. That maybe change isn't failing because you're not doing enough, but because the one doing it is unchanged. This realization doesn't bring immediate answers. It brings a pause, a hesitation in the usual impulse to fix and push. And in that pause, a new question begins to surface quietly. What if the mind that is trying to solve the problem is the same mind that created the loop in the first place? There is a mistake so common that it almost never gets questioned. You assume that the same mind that analyzes your life, judges it, and tries to improve it is also capable of freeing you from its own patterns. It feels logical. After all, the mind has helped you survive, adapt, and function. Why wouldn't it also be the tool that fixes what feels broken? But this is where the loop hides in plain sight. The mind that is trying to change your life is not a neutral observer. It is shaped by the same experiences, fears, and conclusions that created the problem in the first place. It doesn't step outside the system. It operates from inside it, using the same reference points, the same assumptions, the same emotional memory. So when this mind tries to create change, it does so by rearranging familiar elements. It doesn't question the frame. It only moves things around within it. This is why solutions often feel like variations of the same theme, different strategies, same emotional result. The mind solves problems by comparison. It looks at what is happening and measures it against what it knows. But if what it knows is rooted in the past, then every solution it generates is, in some way, past-based. It cannot imagine a future that doesn't resemble its memory, because memory is its raw material. This is why insight alone doesn't liberate. You can understand your patterns intellectually and still repeat them emotionally. You can explain your reactions and still be governed by them. The mind becomes very good at describing the loop without ever stepping out of it. In fact, analysis can strengthen the trap. The more you think about the problem, the more energy you give to the identity of being the one who has a problem. The mind stays busy, active, important. It feels useful. And usefulness becomes its justification for staying in control. Trying to change with this same mind often feels like arguing with yourself. One part wants freedom, another wants safety. One part dreams, another warns. The internal dialogue never ends because both sides are using the same language, the same logic, the same emotional currency. It's like trying to see your own eyes without a mirror. The instrument you're using is the very thing you're trying to observe. So the effort loops back on itself. This is where people get stuck in cycles of self-improvement without transformation. They add techniques, frameworks, philosophies. The mind absorbs them eagerly, not to dissolve itself, but to decorate itself. It learns how to talk about presence without being present. It learns how to speak about awareness without surrendering control. From the outside, it can look like growth. From the inside, the tension remains, because the one who wants to change is still the one who needs to be in charge. There's also a subtle fear driving this. If the mind is not the one leading the process, then who is? Letting go of the familiar problem-solving voice can feel like stepping into chaos. The mind warns you that without it, you'll become passive, irresponsible, or lost. So it keeps inserting itself. It narrates your progress. It evaluates your state, it asks, am I doing this right? And in doing so, it reclaims the center. The loop continues not because you lack awareness, but because awareness is being filtered through the same mental structure. You're looking at the prison through the bars, instead of noticing the bars themselves. At some point, a strange fatigue sets in. Not just tiredness, but a sense that no amount of thinking is going to resolve this, that every new insight becomes another layer of mental activity. This fatigue is not failure. It's a signal. It suggests that the mind may not be the doorway out, that the solution might not come from more understanding, but from a different relationship with understanding itself. This doesn't mean rejecting the mind or silencing it by force. That would still be the mind acting. It means noticing something quieter beneath it, a form of awareness that doesn't try to fix, explain, or improve. As this possibility appears, the usual strategies start to feel slightly off. Not wrong, just insufficient. The mind still wants to help, but it no longer feels like the final authority. And right here in this subtle shift, another illusion begins to crack. Because if the mind can learn, adopt, and mimic change without releasing control, then even spiritual practices can be absorbed into the same loop. And that realization opens the door to the next layer of the trap, where growth itself can become another disguise for the old observer. At this stage, many people believe they have found the way out. They discover spirituality, awareness, inner work, or higher understanding, and something genuinely shifts. There is relief. There is meaning. There is the sense of finally moving forward. But quietly, without warning, the loop learns how to survive here too. This is the illusion of evolution. It's one of the most subtle traps because it looks like growth. The language changes. The concepts become refined. The mind now speaks about consciousness, presence, healing, and awakening. On the surface, everything sounds different. Underneath, the observer remains untouched. The same identity that once defined itself through struggle now defines itself through insight. Instead of I'm lost, it becomes I'm becoming aware. Instead of I'm behind, it becomes I'm on a journey. These shifts feel healthier, and in many ways they are. But they can also become a new costume for the same structure. The mind is incredibly adaptable. When it realizes that control through fear is no longer effective, it switches to control through meaning. It learns the language of depth. It studies ideas that promise freedom, but it studies them as objects, not as doorways. This is how spirituality becomes mental. You accumulate understanding, experiences, and perspectives, but the one accumulating them never dissolves. It simply becomes more sophisticated. The observer feels elevated, informed, special in a quiet way, and that sense of elevation becomes another attachment. You may notice this when spiritual practices start to feel like achievements, when calm becomes something to maintain, when awareness becomes something to check. The mind watches itself being mindful, and in doing so it reasserts its position as the center. Even moments of peace can be subtly claimed. I had a deep meditation. I reached a higher state. These statements sound harmless, but they point back to the same structure, a self that is collecting experiences and using them to define itself. The trap deepens because spiritual frameworks often reward effort and insight. You feel progress, you feel cleaner, lighter, more aligned. Yet when life challenges you, the old reactions return with surprising force. The gap between what you know and how you react becomes painfully clear. This creates confusion. You wonder why awareness isn't translating into freedom, why the same emotional triggers still operate, why despite all the understanding, the loop hasn't truly broken. The answer is uncomfortable. Much of what felt like evolution was happening at the level of narrative, not identity. The story about who you are changed. The watcher of the story did not. The observer learned how to observe without surrendering itself. It learned how to talk about ego without letting go of it. It learned how to value presence without actually resting in it. This doesn't mean spiritual practices are useless. They are powerful, but they can be misused by the very structure they are meant to dissolve. When the mind approaches awakening as a goal, it turns it into another project, another future version of itself to reach. And projects always belong to time. They belong to becoming. They keep the observer alive because there is always something more to achieve, integrate, or purify. The illusion feels safe because it provides direction. You feel like you're moving upward instead of in circles. But if the sense of "I am the one evolving" remains central, the loop continues in a more refined form. This is why some of the most spiritually informed people still feel stuck. They have maps, concepts, and experiences, but no true exit. The loop isn't dramatic anymore. It's quiet, polite, intellectually justified, and because it looks peaceful, it's rarely questioned. At some point, a deeper discomfort emerges, a sense that all this knowing hasn't touched something fundamental, that despite the growth, something is still watching, still managing, still positioning itself as the one who is aware. This discomfort is important. It's not a sign of regression, it's the beginning of honesty. It hints that awareness itself may not be something you do or cultivate, but something you are when the observer stops claiming center stage. And as this hint settles, attention naturally starts to turn in a new direction. Not toward practices or ideas, but toward the one who is practicing and understanding. And in that turn, the possibility of a real break begins to form, not through effort or evolution, but through a shift so subtle it almost feels like nothing at all. There comes a moment that doesn't feel dramatic at all. No breakthrough, no sudden clarity, no fireworks. It feels more like a pause that wasn't planned, a small interruption in the usual flow of thoughts. And in that pause, something quietly shifts. You're no longer just aware of what is happening, you're aware of the one who has been reacting all along. This is the breaking point, not because something breaks forcefully, but because something stops holding so tightly. For the first time, the observer itself comes into view. At first, this feels strange. You're so used to looking through the observer that noticing it feels disorienting. It's like realizing you've been wearing tinted glasses your whole life and only now noticing the tint. Nothing outside changes in that moment. The world looks the same, but the way it is being perceived loosens. You start to notice reactions forming before they fully take over. A tightening in the chest, a familiar thought pattern beginning to speak, the urge to interpret, defend, explain. But instead of being swept away by it, there is a slight distance, not resistance, just space. This space is important. It doesn't come from effort. In fact, effort collapses here. You're not trying to fix the reaction or replace it with a better one. You're simply seeing it as it is. And in that seeing, the observer is no longer invisible. The mind doesn't like this at first. It tries to reassert itself. It may label the experience, analyze it, turn it into an insight. But even that movement can be noticed now. The commentary itself becomes something you can watch. This is where the loop begins to weaken. Not because you're doing something new, but because the automatic identification is interrupted. The observer can only run the script when it believes it is you. When it's seen as a process rather than a self, its authority fades. There's often a moment of vulnerability here. If you're not the observer, then who are you? The mind wants an answer, but none comes immediately, and that uncertainty can feel uncomfortable. The old identity provided orientation. Without it, there is a sense of groundlessness. But that groundlessness is not chaos. It's openness. Awareness without a role to play. Presence without a narrative to maintain. You may notice that emotions still arise. Thoughts still appear. Nothing is being suppressed. The difference is that they no longer define the center. They move through rather than speak from the throne. This is not a permanent state you enter and never leave. The observer will try to reclaim its position. It will pull you back into identification, especially in emotionally charged situations. But something has changed. Even when you get pulled back, a part of you knows it's happening. That knowing is irreversible. You begin to sense the difference between awareness and the observer. Awareness doesn't rush. It doesn't judge. It doesn't need to comment. It simply allows what is there to be seen. The observer, by contrast, is always in a hurry to conclude, to protect, to position. As this distinction becomes clearer, you start to feel how much energy was being spent maintaining the old identity. The tension, the vigilance, the constant internal narration. Seeing the observer reveals the cost of being it. This doesn't make life immediately easy. In fact, challenges may feel sharper for a while, because you're not numbing them with automatic stories, but there is also a strange lightness, a sense that you don't have to become anything in order to be present. The loop doesn't vanish instantly, it loses momentum gradually. Each time you notice the observer reacting and you don't collapse into it, the script weakens. Not through suppression, but through lack of identification. And here's the subtle shift that sets the stage for what comes next. You start to realize that no one has been holding you back. There was no external enemy, no unfair force. The repetition was happening because the unconscious version of you was still driving. As this becomes clearer, attention naturally turns toward the situations that keep repeating, not as problems to fix, but as signals, invitations to see where the observer still takes over automatically. And in that seeing, the next layer of freedom quietly begins to unfold. Once you begin to see the observer, another belief starts to dissolve. The idea that something or someone outside of you has been holding you back. Circumstances, people, timing, the past. These explanations once felt convincing, but now they begin to feel incomplete. Not because life is easy or fair, but because the repetition no longer points outward. It points inward toward a version of you that has been operating automatically, quietly anchoring you to familiar ground. This unconscious version is not your enemy. It doesn't sabotage you on purpose. It is simply running old instructions. It steps in before awareness does. It reacts faster than thought. And because it is fast, it feels authoritative. When something goes wrong, it appears instantly with interpretations you've heard before. When something goes right, it quietly limits how much you receive. It tells you what's realistic, what's safe, what to expect. And because it sounds like you, it rarely gets questioned. This is the version of you that learned how to navigate the world when awareness wasn't yet available. It learned through repetition and emotional imprint. Its job was to keep things predictable, and it succeeded. Too well. The situations that repeat in your life are not punishments. They are not signs of failure. They are reflections of where this unconscious self still takes control. Each recurring pattern marks a place where awareness fades and habit takes over. You may notice this most clearly in moments of emotional intensity. Stress, conflict, rejection, uncertainty. In these moments, the unconscious version doesn't ask permission. It assumes command. The body tightens, the mind narrows, the story appears fully formed. And later, when you reflect, you might wonder why you reacted that way again, why you said the same thing, felt the same thing, chose the same thing. It can feel like being pulled by something invisible. But now you're starting to see it. The anchor is not external. It's the moment awareness drops and the old self steps in. This realization can be uncomfortable. It removes the comfort of blame. If no one is holding you back, then you can't wait for permission or rescue. But it also removes helplessness, because what is unconscious can become conscious, and what becomes conscious loses its absolute power. The unconscious version anchors you through emotion more than thought. It pulls you back to familiar emotional states, because those states confirm identity. Even frustration, sadness, or longing can feel like home if you've lived there long enough. So when life invites you into something new, the unconscious self may generate discomfort, doubt, self-criticism, a sudden loss of motivation, not because the opportunity is wrong, but because it doesn't match the internal baseline. This is how the anchor works. It doesn't need to stop you directly. It only needs to make the unfamiliar feel unsafe and the familiar feel true. As awareness grows, you begin to notice this process in real time. You catch the moment when emotion spikes and the old narrative rushes in. You feel the pull toward reaction. And sometimes you still go with it. But something is different now. You know what just happened. That knowing creates a gap. And in that gap, choice slowly becomes possible. Not dramatic choice, not the kind that feels heroic. Simple choice, to pause, to breathe. To not immediately believe the story that just appeared. This doesn't mean the unconscious version disappears. It still shows up. It still reacts. But it no longer operates in total darkness. Each time it surfaces and is seen, its grip loosens slightly. The anchor begins to lift not through force but through exposure. The unconscious self cannot survive sustained awareness. It thrives in invisibility. It governs when you are identified with it. As this process unfolds, the question subtly changes. It's no longer, why does this keep happening to me? It becomes, where did awareness leave just now? That shift changes everything. Life stops being a battle against repetition and becomes a field of observation. The repeating situations lose their heaviness and gain informational value. They show you exactly where the unconscious version still runs the show. And as this becomes clearer, another, deeper step comes into view. Seeing the unconscious self is powerful, but it still exists. It still carries the identity you once believed was you. And at some point, awareness begins to sense that breaking the loop may require something more radical than observation alone. It may require letting go of the observer itself. At a certain point, observation reaches its limit. You can see the patterns. You can feel the unconscious reactions forming. You can even pause before acting on them. And yet, something still remains. A center, a sense of me that is quietly present watching everything unfold. This is where the deepest step appears, and it's the one most people resist without knowing why. Breaking the loop is not about improving the observer. It's not about making it calmer, wiser, or more spiritual. It's about abandoning the belief that the observer is who you are. This feels threatening at first, because the observer has been your reference for as long as you can remember. It's the voice that says I, the position from which you interpret experience. Letting go of it doesn't feel like growth. It feels like loss. A subtle kind of death. Not the death of the body, but the death of ownership. The death of the one who claims experiences, reactions, and stories as mine. The mind resists this deeply. It asks, if I'm not the observer, then what's left? It imagines emptiness, passivity, disappearance. But this fear comes from misunderstanding. What dissolves is not awareness, but the contraction around it. When the observer loosens, something else becomes obvious. Experience continues without a center narrating it. Sensations arise, thoughts appear, emotions move, but they no longer revolve around a solid self. They happen and they pass. This is not a dramatic state, it's almost ordinary. So ordinary that the mind often overlooks it. There is no special feeling to cling to, no identity to maintain, just a quiet openness where life moves freely. The loop breaks here because there is no longer an internal position to repeat from. Repetition requires a reference point, an identity that reacts in predictable ways. When that reference softens, reactions lose their consistency. They may still arise, but they don't define the field. Abandoning the observer doesn't mean suppressing thought or emotion. It means no longer standing behind them as a fixed identity. The observer dissolves not through effort, but through non-ownership. This is why trying to let go doesn't work. Letting go implies a someone who is letting go. The shift happens when that someone is seen as another appearance, another movement in awareness, not the source of it. At first, this can feel unstable. Without the observer, there's no script, no internal commentator to explain what's happening. Silence appears in unexpected places, and the mind may rush to fill it. But if that rush is also seen, without grabbing onto it, the silence remains. Not as emptiness, but as space. Space in which life unfolds without repetition. In this space, the past loses its authority, not because it's erased, but because it's no longer being consulted. Memory exists, but it doesn't dictate. The body responds, but it's not defending an identity. This is where the loop truly ends. Not because you forced a new reality, but because the one who kept replaying the old one is no longer at the center. Freedom here doesn't feel euphoric. It feels unburdened, simple. There is a sense that nothing needs to be protected or proven. Life is met directly, without filters. And yet this isn't something you achieve once and for all. The observer can reappear. Old habits can return. But the difference is profound. You know now that the observer is optional. That it's a pattern, not a truth. Each time it arises, it can be seen, and each time it is seen, it loses solidity. The loop no longer has a place to anchor. What remains is not a new identity, but a living awareness that doesn't repeat itself. An awareness that responds freshly, moment by moment, without dragging the past forward. And in that, life begins to move again. Not in circles, but openly. Not driven by who you thought you were, but free from the need to be anyone at all. Freedom doesn't begin when life finally changes. It begins when the one who has been watching life loosens its grip, when you stop trying to rearrange the world and start noticing the position you've been standing in while looking at it. The loop was never your destiny. It was a habit of perception, quietly repeated until it felt permanent. Nothing outside needs to disappear for this to happen. The shift is intimate, subtle. It's the moment awareness takes the place of the old observer, not by force but by clarity. And in that clarity, repetition loses its power. Life doesn't need to be controlled anymore. It can be met. If this resonated with you, write this sentence in the comments so I know you stayed until the end. I see the observer now. And if this perspective spoke to you, choose one of the videos appearing on your screen. They go deeper into this same space of awareness and real change. Watch it only if you want more of this kind of understanding.